linguistic, and information retrieval. And he'll share his work today on a specific use case, notably in fairness schemes in kidney exchange programs. William, when you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the paper we recently submitted to the Informs Journal on Computing. So this has to do with kidney exchange programs and combining fairness with utility. So here's the content of the talk today. So I'm first going to talk to you a little bit about kidney exchange programs and the reason for them. And I'm going to mention the research question that we wanted to explore. So first of all, what is a kidney exchange program? So if you are a patient that needs to have a kidney transplanted, but you don't have a compatible donor, you might enter a kidney exchange program with a donor, incompatible donor. Typically, this is a family member or a friend, and you try to find somebody that's in the same situation as you in order to exchange donor with that person. And the goal is that everyone gets a compatible kidney in the end. Of course, this is for pairwise exchanges, but we can generalize to cycles of that are larger than that. So we can have exchanges using 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is we want to form a cycle because in practice, what is done is all the transplants are realized at the same time. So this is why we need to have cycles. For logistic reasons, usually kidney exchange programs enforce some type of constraint on the size of the cycle. So usually we don't get above cycles of size more than 6. There's also another type of node in a kidney exchange graph, These are non-directed anonymous donors. So a non-directed anonymous donor is not a pair of incompatible donor and patient. So this is just a donor. And for example, in this figure, the donor V can give to the patient from V1. And then you can start a chain instead of a cycle. And then the patient from the donor from V1 can give to the patient from V2. And at the end of a chain, we can take the donor from V2 and put it back in a future run of a kidney exchange pool. So we usually represent the kidney exchange graph as a graph like this. And here on this particular example, we select 2 cycles. So one of the cycles is of length 3 and the other of length 2. And the typical goal of a kidney exchange program is to maximize the total number of transplants. So here we would get 5 transplants in this particular example. Also, we might want to maximize a weighted sum over the selected exchanges. So for example, in the Canadian Kidney Pair Donation Program, each of the cycle, they get a system of weights attributed to them. So this system is predetermined. It was predetermined by doctors and policymakers. So they give different weights to the different features of the cycle. So for example, you might have certain points given to based on the geographic location of the patient and the donor. You might have something to do with how hard to match that patient is. So this measure is called CPRA. So this is a proxy for how hard to match a patient is. So the higher this measure is, the more weight we give to them, because in the pool, what typically happens is they tend to accumulate over time. So we want to clear them out of the pool as soon as possible. Most of the programs, they prioritize the utilitarian objective. So each of many different countries have their own versions of these weight systems. They all have different points. So the US has one, Netherlands also. But all of them, they usually want to prioritize the utilitarian objective. So the research questions we wanted to consider was what happens when you try to include fairness as part of the optimization process? Because as I mentioned previously, if we just maximize the total number of transplants, what might end up happening is that some of the patients are never selected in the solution because of their particular features. So we want to ensure that the way we select the solution is fair. So we want to consider that. And then obviously the question is, which concepts of fairness are relevant to kidney exchange programs? And obviously, since we are dealing with both utility and fairness, we want to have a measure of how good these fairness measures are doing. So we have the cost to utility, which is what we'll call price of fairness. So the price of fairness, what this is if you have a fair solution, you can measure how well it performs with respect and compared to the utilitarian objective, which is just typically maximizing the utility function. Okay, so for those reasons, our contributions, we contribute a procedural fair algorithm, and we adapt different fairness schemes, which I'm going to talk about, to kidney exchange programs, and we provide practical implementations using a method of column generation. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the fairness background for KEPS. So typically this is split into 4 categories. So the first one is group fairness. So you can obviously think of, for example, the blood type of the patient. So patients who have blood type O are usually hard to find them a compatible donor. So you can think of them as a minority group. So in that particular setting, you want to ensure that they are treated fairly compared to the other blood types. There's also cross-border fairness. So this looks at kidney exchange programs that involve multiple countries. So this is especially true in Europe, where you have multiple countries all participating in the same kidney exchange program. So you want to ensure that the patients from the different countries get treated equally. You also have egalitarian mechanisms such as Lorentz dominance. And finally, the last one, which is individual fairness. So individual fairness deals with the probability of getting a transplant for all of the patients. So in this article that we wrote, we considered not only just a single solution for a kidney exchange plan. So this is just not one exchange plan, but we considered probability distributions over all the feasible exchange plans. And for this particular example, if you look at the compatibility graph in figure 5, so the arcs represent compatibility between the nodes. So let's say an arc from node 2 to node 1 means the donor from node 2 can give to the patient from node 1. And you have 3 solutions in this particular example. So you have three cycles that you can select. And if you give certain probabilities to the selection of each of these cycles, you can compute the probability that each individual will get a transplant. So if you give 0.4, 0.2, and 0.4 to S1, S2, and S3, you can compute the probabilities that each patient gets a transplant. And this is given on the table on the left. So this notion is what we refer to the utility objective of each of the patients. So what the utility of each patient is basically the probability that you get a transplant. And then I'm going to talk about fairness schemes and how we apply them to KEPS. So basically what a fairness scheme is it's a way to allocate resources, because here the kidneys are the resources and the patients are the different individuals are the patients. And we want to allocate the kidneys to the patients in a way that is fair. So there's many different ways to go about it. And the fairness schemes, they ensure that the selection process or the actual outcome of the selection process is a fair allocation. So of course, you can come up with your own version of this. We only consider the 4 most common approaches in the literature. So the first one, which is Aristotle's equity principle. So the idea behind it is that a fair allocation should consider pre-existing rights to resources. So in KEPS, what this translates to is the time spent in the program. So the longer a patient has been in the program, the higher the priority they should receive. And the same for the health status. So this kind of mimics what happens in triage in a hospital. And also the PRA, which I mentioned previously, which is a proxy for how difficult it is to match that patient. So the patients that are harder to match, they should get priority because over time they tend to accumulate in the pool. There's also the Nash standard of comparison. So this has to do with the relative utility. So if you move from one allocation to the other, so an allocation is considered fair if by moving away from this allocation, the sum of the relative gains over all the patients is negative. So that means in total, if you move away from this allocation, you do worse in terms of the probabilities of getting a transplant. Mathematically, this is what it looks like. I'm not going to go too much into detail about it. But the third one is Ralston justice. So this is like the max min in optimization. So you want to maximize the utility of the least well-off patients. So this is maximizing the minimum probability of getting a transplant over all the patients. And finally, there's the individual fairness one, which optimizes the distance to the mean probability. So mathematically, this is what it looks like. So here, the delta V's are the probability of getting a transplant for all of the patients. And the delta bar is the mean probability. So you want to ensure that these probabilities are balanced and you don't have some patients that get 0 probability and some of the others get too high a probability. Of course, if you have 100% chance of getting a transplant, to you, it doesn't mean that much. If you get 95%, let's say instead, in order to give some chance to the others. Okay, so if we only optimize over fairness, obviously we can pay a huge price to utility. So what we want to do here is we want to combine both utility and fairness at the same time. So we have basically a multi-objective setting. We considered actually two approaches to that. We have one, which is the typical linear combination of the two objectives. So again, one utilitarian objective and one fairness objective. And the fairness objective is a mathematical formulation of one of the four fairness schemes that we talked about. So we have the linear combination of it, which we referred to as the social welfare program. And there's another approach, which is called the Nash social welfare program, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about later. And the goal is to obtain a solution that balances these two objectives well. In order to do both of these methods, we have to come up with a column generation method because there's exponentially many solutions and it would be intractable to just enumerate them beforehand. So the National Social Welfare Program, it looks like this. So the idea behind it is you have your two objectives and it's probably better to just look at the picture, but you have your F1 on the Y-axis and your F2 on the X-axis. And you have your two objectives plus another point, which is called the reference point. In our case, the reference point is the nadir point for the two objectives. And the idea behind it is if you look at the three blue dots represent different solutions that you can select. And if you select the one on the top left corner, you would get a good value of F1. But if you look at the area that you would get from the D vector, it would just be a line. So the area would be 0. So intuitively, what this tells you is that it's not a good balance of the objectives. Well, if you look at the solution on the top right-hand corner, you maximize this area from the three solutions, and the size of the area is a proxy for how good you balance the two objectives. So this is the idea behind it. And of course, the fairness objective is, as I mentioned, one of the fairness schemes we mentioned previously. So just to give you a little bit of an example, I'm not going to go into detail about all the mathematical formulation, but this is what the mathematical program for the National Social Welfare Program looks like for the individual fairness objective. We used L1 norm instead of L2 norm. So this is what it looks like. And the key point I want to underscore here is that the delta S's here, they represent the probability given to one solution. And there's exponentially many of these variables. So obviously we cannot enumerate them beforehand. So we have to take the dual of this. We get a constraint that corresponds to these variables. And then we can add these constraints. We formulate a subproblem basically where the objective of the subproblem corresponds to one of these constraints. And we generate new solutions on the fly in order to obtain the optimal solution to this program. Summary of the insights, basically, we've seen that the single schemes, so this is just optimizing for fairness, they have a significantly higher price of fairness than the multi-objective approaches. So this is good, I guess. And for the multi-objective approaches with individual fairness and Ralgian justice, there's a significant impact on fairness compared with the utilitarian approach. So basically what this means is if you compare these methods with respect to the fairness objective, how they perform, there's a significant improvement compared to just maximizing the total number of transplants. As you can see on the pictures here, so the yellow lines represent just the utilitarian approach. So there's a significant gap for both of the multi-objective methods compared to the utilitarian approach. For the other two fairness schemes, so this is Nash and Aristotle's, we didn't see too much of a difference. So that was kind of surprising to us, but the first two methods, we actually did see a massive improvement. So future research. So we want to look at accounting for time sensitivity in health conditions, because as of now, this was only done for the static case. So the kept graph is given at one iteration and you just optimize it. But we want to account for time sensitivity in health conditions. We also account for variation in graph topology because you might have departure, you might have arrival of new nodes in the future, and this might impact the different compatibility probabilities for the nodes present in the graph at the current time. And also individual fairness. I didn't go into detail about that, but there's an inherent weakness of this approach. It's not well suited to multi-objective optimization. So basically, if you have, let's say, the empty exchange plan, which basically you perform no transplants at all, according to that fairness objective, that would be good. But it makes no sense to consider the empty exchange plan. So then in order to tackle that problem, we have come up with a bi-level optimization approach to solve this issue. And that's all I have for you today.